the alpha male, if he has a supporter who keeps him in that position, then he needs to give that supporter a lot of things. Otherwise, what would be in it for the supporter, you know?
Well, what kind of things do you see the alpha doing in this more reciprocal sense?
Well, the typical situation is that the alpha male is dependent on another male. He will let the other male mate with females, which is what dominance is really all about among the males, is that access to females. And so he may be intolerant to every other male and keep them away from females, but his buddy who made him alpha, he let them mate with females, because if he doesn't, and I've seen this happen, if he doesn't, then his buddy will revolt and will stop supporting him.
Right, so that also indicates, so, you know, you might ask yourself why the instinct to allow for reciprocal dominance exists in human beings, given that access to mating privilege is such a crucial element of reproduction. But if part of that is that if we can make coalitions with our superordinates, say, make coalitions, even though we're not dominant, and that ability to form coalitions upward is associated with sexual access, because the dominant male chimps, they chase other males away from the females, right? The females will mate. This is something that makes them different than human females. The female chimps will mate with pretty much any male when they're nestrous, if I understand it properly. But the more dominant males will no, is that wrong?
Yeah, the females, there's a big issue with female choice, as we call it. Females have preferences for certain males. And these preferences don't need to correspond with the male hierarchy. And so we used to think that the dominant male would sire most offspring because we saw the dominant males mate more often than other males. But females do all sorts of things behind the bushes and at night. And so we now know from paternity testing that the dominant male is not always the one who has the most offspring. And that is because females have preferences, different preferences.
Right. Would you say, okay, so let me update myself in relationship to that. My understanding of the primatology literature, and insofar as it extended to humans, was that human females were in some sense unique in the degree to which they exercised sexual choice with concealed ovulation and so forth, and that was part of perhaps what drove our rapid departure away from chimpanzees, let's say, on the cognitive front. But you're saying as well that choice in chimpanzee female choice plays a more important role than might have originally been predicted.
I think it started with the birds, you know. We have monogamous birds, songbirds, male, female, and they have a nest with eggs. And we've always assumed that the male was the father of all these, fertilized all the eggs. But now, since paternity testing, this started in the 1970s, we know that if you look at the eggs, you very often find extra pair males in there, so different males who have mated with the female. Initially, the biologists assumed, very Victorian type of assumption, they assumed that, of course, the female was probably raped by other males or something like that. But now we know that the females actively look for sex with other males. And so in the bird literature, it's very well known, and we distinguish social monogamy from genetic monogamy. And most of the monogamy that we see is social. It's not necessarily genetic in the sense that the male is the father of all the offspring. Now, and since then, we have now lots of studies on other animals, including the primates, that we know, for example, a female chimpanzee, she mates with many more males than would be necessary to be fertilized. She mates with lots of males. And she has certain preferences that we now learn about. It's called female choice, and that's a big literature on female behavior. So females have very often preferences that deviate from the male hierarchy.
So let me push you on that a bit. So I looked at human studies, and the correlation between sexual success and socioeconomic status for men in relationship to sexual success with women is about somewhere between 0.6 and 0.7, which is an unbelievably, stunningly high correlation. It's higher than the correlation between intelligence and academic performance, for example, which is maybe the second highest correlation of that sort we know. And so But that shows in human beings that the female preference and the male hierarchy are pretty tightly aligned. How close are they aligned in chimps? And if they're not aligned, what are the females looking for that isn't signaled by the hierarchical structure of the males?
In humans, of course, the female preference has also to do with status and income, in the sense of resources. Which is not so much the case in chimpanzees, I would say, because they don't have a nuclear family structure.
And they don't obviously gather resources the same.
Yeah. So we humans have a nuclear family structure, so the males are involved in the family and in caring for offspring, which is not really the case in bonobos and chimpanzees. And so the human female has a more complex picture in front of her, which includes maybe sexual preference, which may be based on the body or the appearance and so on, but it also is based on, she also looks for resources. So I think it's a more complex picture probably.
So I'm curious about that too, because tell me what you think of this. It seems to me that although socioeconomic status and mating success in human males is very tightly associated, that human females aren't looking so much for status or even socioeconomic position. They're using those as markers for the ability to generate resources and social status. And so, because really what they want, and I think this is tied with your work on reciprocity and social skill in chimpanzees, what the human females really want is competence and generosity. And they use social status and resource acquisition as a marker for that.
Yeah, that's very well possible. I'm not so familiar with that human literature, but there is a big field now of female initiative, female choice, female sexuality. Biology started out pretty Victorian in the sense that female sexuality didn't exist. Females were passive sexually. Males were active and had a sex drive, but females basically didn't need it. That's how the biologists thought about it. And all that thinking has changed. In my book on gender, I talk quite a bit about female sexuality and the size of the clitoris and so on, which is related to that, seeking pleasure and so on. I think it's highly significant that we see that female chimpanzees and certainly female bonobos, they have quite a bit more sex than is necessary for strictly for reproduction. So they are very adventurous. And the female bonobo has a big clitoris, bigger than the human female, and the biggest one is in the dolphin, which is also a sexually adventurous species. And so people are now paying attention to that, whereas we went through a long period where female sexuality was basically ignored.